Regents Prep lesson number 3. Our aim today is how did America's involvement in wars, both foreign and domestic, help shape the United States? And I want you guys to focus in on a few key things, when looking at both the domestic wars, such as, say, the Civil War, and foreign wars, such as World War I and World War II. How did American involvement in these really change the way in which the United States operated, or, how it changed the size or the power of the United States? And that's what we're going to look at today. The first war we're going to look at, and we're just going to, touch on quickly, is the American Revolution. Um, if you guys recall back to the American Revolution, America signs the Declaration of Independence and sends it to Great Britain. It is a breakup letter. America says it wants to be its own country. However, Great Britain doesn't give in that easily. All right? And when we talk about that, America had to fight Great Britain for their independence. Great Britain came to America, the Redcoats, they tried to fight them, and America was able to stand tall and gain their independence, right? It was caused because of the colonial rule from the British. America was, I shouldn't call them America yet, when they were still the colonies, they were being taxed without representation, and because of that, they felt that, they were not getting the democracy and the natural rights that they were, promised by, the concepts of John Locke and natural rights. And because of that, they did sign the Declaration of Independence and declare their independence, fought the American Revolution, and they became a country. The next big war that we need to know is the Mexican War. And when you think of the Mexican War, I think the key term to think about is manifest destiny. This was a war simply fought with Mexico to gain land. And the land that was gained, we're talking about parts of Texas, New Mexico, all that area, parts of California, manifest destiny, and the concept of westward expansion. If we think about manifest destiny, it's the idea that, God wanted this spread of America from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The next one we need to talk about is the Civil War. And the Civil War, a lot of people say it was fought over the idea of slavery, but if we really talk about what the Civil War was fought over, it's fought over the preservation of the Union. If you guys recall, when Abraham Lincoln is elected president, all right, South Carolina and other southern states secede or leave the Union. And Abraham Lincoln, his job as president is to make sure the Union does not dissolve, does not separate. And he, takes the North to fight the South, the Union to fight the Confederacy, to bring the country, to bring the state back together. Bring the countries back together, because no state can leave the Union. It is a collection of states, not of people. Of people, not of states, and therefore, they couldn't just secede. And this showed the federal power over the states, the federal government stepping in when states wanted to leave. And while slavery was a big part of this, because Abraham Lincoln was anti-slavery, and when he was elected president, the South left, the real thing that brings them to the war is the secession of the South. And once the South leaves the Union, the North and Lincoln declare war to bring the country back together. And with that being said, our first check for understanding of the day: the basic constitutional issue resolved by the Civil War was the A. Expansion of the president's war powers, B. Extension of the right to vote to all adults, C. The supremacy of the federal authority over the states, or D. Civil liberties of citizens during wartime. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. The next thing we're going to talk about is the Spanish-American War. And when you talk about the Spanish-American War, a few key words you want to think about is yellow journalism, American imperialism, the USS Maine. If you recall, America, gets into this problem with Spain because America claims that the Spanish are treating the Cubans poorly, and really the idea behind it is imperialism and the concept of America wanting to spread its power to other parts of the world. So they, with the help of journalists, or yellow journalism, if you remember that, America begins to kind of makes the Spanish look worse than they are, and when the USS Maine, an American ship, is sunk, um, they the yellow journalists automatically blame it on the Spanish, when in reality it was mechanical failures. And because of that, America declares war on Spain. It's a very quick and easy war that America wins. It shows their power. It shows them as the most powerful nation in the world. And America gains the Philippines, Guam, Cuba, and Puerto Rico because of that. If we look at our check for understanding for that, one major result of the Spanish-American War was that the United States, A, established many foreign aid programs, B, obtained overseas colonies, C, abandoned the principles of the Monroe Doctrine, or D, settled disputes by relying on international peace organizations. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. The next one to talk about is World War One. And if you recall, before World War One, the United States is in a policy of isolation and neutrality. And even when World War One starts in 1914, America is not involved. All right, they enter the war in 1917 after the Zimmerman telegram, where Germany was trying to bring them into the war by telling Mexico to attack them, and also the sinking of the Lusitania, which killed many Americans. And World War One was not a terrible war for the United States, but it gave women, the power to work in factories. They helped out in the war effort, the first kind of total war. And because of women's work in the factories, when the men come home, they are very impressed. And this pushes the women forward in their right to vote. They gain the right to vote only a year after, or a few years after, 3 years after the end of World War One. World War II, once again, before World War II in the interwar period, the United States is neutral. If you recall, after World War One, they don't get involved in the Treaty of Versailles. All right, they refuse to be part of the League of Nations, even though Wilson in his 14 points is the one that has that idea. Um, the Neutrality Acts, the United States basically says they are neutral and not involved. However, they are doing the Lend-Lease Act, where they are giving supplies to Britain and France. And on the other side, when the United States stops trading with Japan because of their treatment of China, the U.S., they stop trading with Japan, and Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and this brings the United States into the war. And what we need to also know about the war is women, their role expanded during the war. If you guys remember Rosie the Riveter, the kind of slogan, "We can do it." Women were working to help the war effort, and the war ends with the atomic bombs on Japan. Um, it's a very important war for the United States, and once again, they enter the war late because they are neutral at the beginning, and they are successful in ridding the world of the fascist regimes of Hitler and Mussolini. And afterwards, they're going to go right into the Cold War. And when we talk about the Cold War, there are two important wars within the Cold War that we need to look at. There's the Korean War. The Korean War is fought between North Korea, which is communist, and South Korea, which is democratic. And the United Nations, not just the United States, gets involved in this to try to stop the spread of communism. If you recall, the U.S. policy at this time is containment. And the United States, their job during containment, or the policy of containment, was to stop the spread of communism, not to really get rid of communism, to stop the spread of it. And in Korea, they were pretty successful because communism stopped at the 38th parallel, basically where it was before the United States got there. So the United States and the United Nations were able to stop the spread of communism in Korea. However, as we look at the Cold War in Vietnam, so the Vietnam War, this was a much more protested war. A lot of people didn't agree with the United States being in Vietnam. This was not a war that was supported in America by any means. The president expanded his powers during this through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave the United States president more power. The United States is going to fail, and this was also the goal of containment. And North Vietnam is going to take over South Vietnam, and this is going to become completely communist, showing an American failure. And at the end of this war, if you guys remember, in 1973, the War Powers Act is passed, which limits the power of president in wartime. Looking at the Persian Gulf War in 1991, This was fought over oil in the Middle East and the United Nations protection of Kuwait from Iraq. Iraq was invaded by Saddam Hussein. I'm sorry, Kuwait was invaded by Iraq and Saddam Hussein, and this was strictly for oil. And the United States and the United Nations step in to prevent this from happening. And then the two more recent wars, the war on terrorism, which happens right after 9/11 to rid the Middle East of the Taliban and Al Qaeda. Um, Taliban was a very ruthless group of leaders in Afghanistan, and Al Qaeda is a terrorist organization which was responsible for 9/11. And finally, the Iraqi War, the war in Iraq, um, which America invaded Iraq because they believed there was weapons of mass destruction. And while they were there, they couldn't find no weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein was taken out of power and executed, and America and the rest of the United Nations uh, went to spread democracy to Iraq. Our last check for understanding. At the outbreak of World War I in 1914, most Americans believed that A. their country should stay out of the war, B. sending direct aid to Russia was necessary and desirable, C. the government should immediately declare war against Germany, or D. the government should be more concerned with conditions in the Far East than with events in Europe. And we will talk more about this tomorrow. Have a good night.